All right. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Alex from Namely. We're joined by Eric Knudsen and Monique Hughes from Culture Amp. We've got some really educational content for you today. A lot of people still rolling in. So thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please just use the Q&A section. Both of our respective teams will be watching those, and we'll take some time throughout to answer those. So let's move on. I want to get through some housekeeping before we get started. Just in case you didn't know, we are recording this webinar. So if you have to drop out, you've got a meeting, run to grab lunch if you're on the East Coast, don't worry, we're going to send an on-demand copy directly following this event as soon as it processes. And as a bonus, we'll even include the slide deck so you can sit back and just take notes and review it after the fact. As I mentioned, if you have any questions or need more information, we're all live on this webinar. So the Q&A in Zoom should be at the bottom of your screen. I'm actually at the top, I believe. Please use that. We'll be watching those, and if we want to address it live, we will flag it as answering it live, and we will do just that when we have time for Q&A. Additionally, if you have any questions about our respective products, you can email the Culture Amp team at peoplegeeks@cultureamp.com. And I know it's not on there, but you can email hello@namely.com and we'll get you the appropriate information. Additionally, both of our teams are incredibly active on social. You can tweet at us at CultureAmp or at Namely, and we'll be interacting with attendees throughout this call. So thanks again for joining. We'll get started in just a few minutes, but before we do that, I want to introduce you to our hosts, both experts in the employee engagement space. We've put together some really great content, and credit to them. They've worked together on this, and I think we're all proud of what you guys are going to watch, and you'll get some nice actionable takeaways. So first, from the Culture Amp team, we've got Monique Hughes. Monique is a senior customer success coach based in SF. She has her master's in business management and coaches some of the world's most progressive companies on their approach to employee feedback and driving competitive advantage through company culture. Just working with her, I know she's an expert in the space, and she's got a lot of good stuff for you today. On our side, on the Namely side, we have Eric Knudsen. He is on the people team here. He is a senior analyst of people operations. As you guys may know, probably by getting this invite, Namely is the all-in-one HR, payroll, and benefits platform built for today's employees. I've worked with Eric personally on focusing on leveraging people data spanning the entire employee lifecycle to help improve decision-making here at Namely. So as I mentioned, they're both experts. They've got a lot to talk about when it comes to communication and employee engagement today. So with that, let's jump right in and learn about exactly what we're going to cover today. So today we've got 5 key points that we're going to touch on. And like I said, I just want to reiterate this because I see a lot of people still joining in. We will distribute this recording at the end. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A in Zoom throughout. So what we'll cover specifically today, first we're going to touch on the importance of developing a great survey communication plan, why it's important for your organization to really focus on the communication plan itself. Second, we'll touch on the core themes and topics to cover in your communication. Next, we'll move on to some specific tips to make your communications more effective. Me personally, when working on this slide deck, I found a lot of nice actionable items in here, and I learned a lot about the entire process in this specific section. Next, we've got a really detailed survey communication framework that we'll cover, including pre-survey comms, during survey comms, and even afterwards, what follow-up you should have. And then lastly, we'll touch on understanding the effectiveness of communications and how that can really impact employee engagement and really help out the team. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce both of our speakers. Thank you guys so much. And as I mentioned, I'll be in the chat answering any questions any of the attendees have. So thank you guys so much. At the very end, we'll have time for Q&A. So let's jump right in.
All right, so we're going to get started just by talking about and sort of setting the scene for the importance of a great communication plan. So communication is clearly essential for facilitating a better employee understanding of the survey. And there are multiple reasons that we build a clear communication plan. The first is to provide context. So not all employees have ever experienced an employee survey before. Perhaps their workforce is early career, and so they haven't been through a cycle, or they just happen to work for an employer that wasn't soliciting employee feedback on a regular basis. Although employers are increasingly administering such surveys, we're still seeing that some employers are not seeking this kind of feedback from their employees. And so we want our employees to know what they can expect from these surveys. And so through these communications, we can answer the who, what, and when. And by that, I mean, who will see this survey? Who will respond to it? Who will see results? How will it be used? And what will the experience of completing this survey feel like? If we can communicate these things effectively, our employees are likely to feel excited about the work, excited about their opportunity to speak up. And it also sets realistic expectations about what will come out of the results and how the organization will act on those findings. Perhaps one of the most important and key elements of a communication plan is this indication to employees that this survey is a priority of the organization. So when we outline and plan our communications accordingly, it signals to our employees that this is a meaningful effort and that the organization cares what they have to say. Rather than just clicking launch and suddenly they're asked to perform a task or to spend 20 minutes completing a survey. Now they have, we've sort of set the scene for them so they understand what, how, why this is all happening. And we want our employees to know that their organization is taking their feedback very seriously and then acting on it to improve their experience. And then simply it starts the conversation. Again, if you click launch and suddenly something pops in an employee's inbox, it could be ignored. It could be deprioritized. We're not sending the right message to our employees if we're not starting that conversation a bit before we're asking them to do something. And all of this sort of points at the importance of providing clarity about what this process will feel like, because with greater clarity about process, you're likely to have better participation. And with better participation in these surveys, you're likely to get better data. And with better data, we can make better decisions. So really, this is just the beginning of that pipeline.
Thanks for that, Eric. So just jumping in here. So thanks for the introduction. This is Monique jumping in from the Culture Amp side. Moving right along, just want to pause and I guess set the scene around the conversation that we're having today. So definitely agree with all of those points, Eric. And I really do think that, you know, a really good employee feedback program really feels like an intelligent conversation with your employees. So as we dive into what makes a great communication plan for an engagement survey rollout, it's really worth pausing here because we know that engagement surveys aren't the only time you'll be getting feedback from your employees. What you can see on the screen here is a simple approach to an employee feedback program. something that many of our Culture Amp customers have in place to collect, understand, and act on employee feedback. So you'll notice that the focus today really is on engagement surveys. In terms of what we see, engagement really is that core backbone to your employee feedback approach. So it's something that covers off how engaged your people are, what matters to them, and really encapsulates the experience of the entire workforce. So we'll really be focusing today's conversation around how you can elevate the communication approach for this. That said, today's tips and approaches can readily be applied in the context of other surveys, so do keep that in mind. So before we dive into the nuts and bolts of the communication approach, it's worth recapping on what we're really measuring with engagement surveys. So primarily, we're there to understand the level of connection, motivation, and commitment a person feels for the place that they work. And we know that this sense of engagement can have a whole host of benefits for the organization. So the great thing about engagement surveys is that they really allow us to surface insights on the things about our people, and shed light on where we might have blind spots about our workforce. So the way that I like to think about it, and the way that you can frame this as you're having conversations internally, is through surveys like this, we can answer questions and gather metrics like, how do we cultivate a culture of pride, motivation, and commitment? What drives retention in our company? How do we compare to other organizations where we compete for talent? How do we connect teams with the organization's vision, mission, and goals? And ultimately, how do we help employees become change agents and understand they can create a better place to work? So we want to shift now into some core themes and some tips for doing communications well. So, every organization is going to have different core themes that they want to thread throughout their approach to communicating their employee engagement surveys. So I certainly encourage you to think through what those core themes are in the context of your own organization. In our experience, certainly in my experience in working with lots of companies at Culture Amp, these are some of the core themes that really come through. And these are things that we want to reinforce and shed greater light on each time we communicate with our employees. So I'll touch on each of these briefly. So the first thing is really giving people a sense of what we're measuring. So helping people understand what engagement is. The concept of engagement tends to mean a lot to HR and the leadership team, but not necessarily a lot to employees. And so we want to help them understand what it means when employees are really engaged at their organization. And we want to help them understand what drives engagement and what matters most. We also want them to understand, by measuring engagement, what is this going to allow the organization to do? What outcomes will be achieved? Not just for the leadership team and the HR team, but also for employees in terms of their own lived experience of working at their companies. We also want employees to understand, what do we need from you? And some of the things that come to mind for me are honesty. So we want people to provide candid feedback about their experience working at the company, what works well and what doesn't. Obviously, we want them to participate. So Eric mentioned that great participation leads to great data, which leads to great results. So we really want to drive that participation and engagement in the process. We also want comments. So we want people to shed light on the quantitative responses that they provide. So especially providing comments that are constructive and add additional context and richness so that we can understand the other feedback that they provide. We also want people to understand, what can they expect? So in terms of results, who will see what gets shared, how is it presented? We want them to understand the outcomes that they can expect. So the fact that we're going to drive action as a result of their feedback. And as I said, we want them to be involved in the process, not just around participating in the survey, but also, throughout the process of identifying a focus and then creating action on the basis of that. A really important topic to touch on is confidentiality. And I really encourage companies that I work with to be quite candid around confidentiality when it comes to employee surveys. We want people to provide feedback in an opt-in way, in a way where they feel comfortable. So some of the things that you may share there are things like how your data will be treated, as well as information about the survey. So for example, the kind of demographics that we'll be including. The other really important theme to thread throughout your communications is around preparing people for feedback and action. So getting them excited about the process of actually acting on feedback and ultimately guiding them towards focus and action, not just reflecting on results. So between Eric and I, we've seen a lot of this happen. We've seen a lot of companies do this. And so we certainly have some tips and tricks around making this, more effective. The phrase that I keep coming back to is, what if you were to make your approach to your communication strategy a little bit more like a marketing campaign? What might you do differently? How might this change the game? So for us, some of the things that come to mind are ensuring that you creatively brand and promote your survey. So the team at Namely are going to give us a bit of an overview around how they approach this, but I see a lot of creative approaches to really branding and promoting the survey internally. One of our favorite ones at Culture Amp is one of our customers, Deezer, actually created a playlist that invited people to provide feedback. So it was a really fun and playful way, and certainly something that was unexpected. We also, want you to ensure that you have really clear goals and know your audience. So be clear around what you want your employees to think, feel, and do throughout the process of engaging in the survey approach and then acting on the feedback. Think about personalizing the concepts. So make it relevant to your employees. Use different phrases, things that are really in the voice of how you talk about different concepts in the organization. Maybe you don't call it employees. Maybe you call it the name of what you call your people internally. So at Culture Amp, we call ourselves campers. As well as think about the different kinds of themes that you might, talk to your employees about. So for example, leadership and management in flat structures, we might talk about that in quite a different way than in a large organization. Also think about the message and the messenger. So it's not so much about, the message is important, but who it comes from is equally as important. We often see a top-down approach being leveraged, but come up with creative and unexpected messengers. Make sure that it's not just coming from the CEO, although that is really important to kind of set the tone around how important this is in the organization, as Eric shared earlier. An obvious one here is to make sure that you use multiple channels and communications to build knowledge over time. So again, have this conversation in different forums. Make sure that you're reaching different parts of your workforce through different channels. And last but not least, and this is a really easy one to forget, is remember to consider the cultural nuances or any needed translations. So many of you on the call today will come from, distributed global workforces that come from different cultures. So think about how to engage different parts of the organization in the approach of providing feedback in a way that resonates with them. An example that comes to mind for me of a customer that we worked with was a video that they put out using only facial expressions so that it was globalized and generalizable and not in any one language. So that's an example there that you can think about as well. So I'm actually going to take this opportunity to pass it back across to Eric, and we can learn a little bit more around how Namely approach this in their organization.
So as you see here, Namely essentially internally built a brand of employee feedback. So sort of touching on the first and also the third bullets on the last slide, that these ideas of creatively branding and promoting your survey and then personalizing those concepts so it feels very specific to your company and your culture. We took that effort very seriously. We wanted to create a signal to employees that it's time to speak up and that their thoughts, their experiences will be taken seriously. And very much like you build a brand, we partnered heavily with our internal marketing team to build the right messaging, to design our logo. And the logo in particular is a critical tool for us. Anytime an employee sees this logo on a document, in a company-wide post or email, it's a signal to our employee that it's time to speak up. And that's really important. So they're no longer just reading words that say engagement survey, but now they see the brand, Namely voice, and it says to them, we want to hear about your experiences over the last 3, 6, 9, 12 months, whatever the timeline for that survey is. So we spent a lot of time with marketing crafting the spirit and the personality of this internal feedback brand. You see the products of some of that effort here. So when we first launched the brand back in fall of 2016, we knew people wouldn't know what it is. Is it a piece of our product? Well, no, it's actually, it's truly the spirit of the engagement effort. That is what Namely Voice is. And the handout on the bottom right you see here communicates that. So that was sort of our first interaction, our first communication to employees about what Namely Voice is. We wanted to familiarize them with the idea of Namely Voice, the goals of Namely Voice, and also the experience of actually providing feedback. You see on that little phone, on that handout, and also on the poster, there's actually a tiny little screenshot of Culture Amp, whom we work with to administer our internal surveys. And so right down to the details of what will you as an employee be experiencing when you go in and provide feedback. We wanted all of that to be very predictable, feel very comfortable and safe to employees. And that was a big part of launching this brand that we now call Namely Voice. You see on the left, we have posters. These posters are a great tool for, and also they can be reused if they're designed in a way that they serve as reminders to employees when a survey window is open. So you can post posters around the office so people know, oh, it's Namely Voice Week or Namely Voice 2 weeks, whatever your survey duration is. It's been a critical tool for us. And personally, I've loved beginning to hear employees talk about Namely Voice instead of the engagement survey, because it steps a bit away from this idea of a survey as a corporate tool and initiative, and more towards the true spirit and personality of the effort, which is we care about you, we care about your experiences. We're employees too, and we have those experiences as well. We want to be sharing our thoughts on that so we can work to improve, really work together to build a better workplace. So next, I'll jump right into basically what is the skeleton of a communication framework for all of you to use, moving from pre-survey to communications you send out during the survey, and then the types of communications you might be sending out after surveys as well. Before we jump into the pre, the during, and the post, I want to take a step back and just discuss sort of any communication during any one of these phases needs to address a few things. The first is really the who. So for this particular communication, say it's a pre-com or a pre-survey com, who's your target audience for that communication? Are you speaking to employees, managers, leaders? Your employee communications might be focused on the details of the survey. When does it open, close, what will it cover? Whereas your leader or manager facing comms might be focused on promoting and building partnership and trust with them so that we can feel confident that they're actively encouraging their teams to complete the survey. I'll touch on that more momentarily. Also the what of the survey. So again, what tools will you use to administer the survey, as well as what tools will you use to actually send out and disseminate these communications? What tools best reach your target audience? Email is pretty much a necessary tool, but it's rarely sufficient. So it's obviously the most commonly used communication tool. Nearly everyone has it, but not everyone checks it regularly. Specific teams in your company might have cultures of communicating on different tools, maybe instant message like Slack, and awareness of these silos of communication can help you with better targeting those teams. So speaking with managers and leaders to understand individual teams' communication tools and styles can really go a long way with making sure that your survey communications are reaching a broad swath of the organization. At Namely, personally, we send emails, we send Slacks. Namely, the product has a company feed where we have company updates and people interact with each other. We always post to the feed about our surveys. You may or may not have a similar feed or source where the entire company is going to for news, but certainly leverage any resource similar to that. In the past, like I said, we've leveraged posters near doors and key parts of the office. The key here is regular but relatively unobtrusive reminders. So we don't want people to feel that they're being bombarded with reminders, but we want them to remember that we're asking for their feedback. And so there's a balance there between sending a sufficient number of reminders and also knowing or designing these reminders in a way that we're creating a rather seamless sort of communication experience so they don't feel that they're being overwhelmed by reminders. And the when, naturally, you're communicating throughout. So before the survey, during the survey, and after the survey, no question. Just like momentum with finding and acting on results, which Monique will speak to, we want momentum in our communications. So we don't want there to be a super long window where people aren't hearing about the survey effort. So here's just a sort of a zoomed in view of that communication timeline. So there are pre-survey communications. During the survey, you might be administering, first of all, the invitation and subsequently a couple reminders. And then there are post-survey communications. We'll touch on each of these now. So starting with pre-survey communications, I'll talk a bit about two critical types of pre-survey communications. One in particular that I think we often forget about. The first, I think, is the more obvious one, and that is the company-wide announcement. So your target audience naturally is all of your employees, including managers, leaders, etc. This communication would touch on things like eligibility. So eligibility it's really an organizational choice. Are you including contractors? Maybe you're restricting it to full-time only. Must they be here for longer than 30 days? These are choices that your organization wants to make based on how they plan on actioning these results. You may also mention time. So when will the survey open and close? How long will it be open for? How will the invitation arrive? Will it be via email? The timing of your survey may depend on, again, organizational choice. It may depend on organizational size. We recommend no shorter than 1 week, preferably 1 to 2 weeks for most surveys. Some organizations may choose for a shorter pulse survey to use a window that is closer to 1 week. But we internally aim to have our surveys open about 2 weeks. And we see that provides sufficient time to send reminders and also bump our participation up enough that we're confident that we have an accurate picture of the employee experience. What does it measure? Why are we measuring it? Again, touching on this idea, the construct of engagement. And naturally, we're measuring it because leaders and the organization care about the employee experience, care about improving and actioning it. And then one you'll get a lot from employees, this question, who will have access to results? So being very transparent about that is critical to establishing trust. The next communication that I'll talk about is the one that I think is forgotten a little more, and that is the manager or leader communication. The target audience here is team and department leaders. So it's important that we as survey owners or survey administrators remember that we have critical partners in our managers and leaders, and we want to remind them of that too. This survey may not be the first priority of every manager or leader in the company, and but often they want to support and encourage their teams to participate. And so we want to remind them that they're important partners in this feedback process, and that we rely on them to promote participation amongst their teams. It reinforces how important it is that we have all of our teams participating in this survey, and including details like, say, reminding the leader or manager what their team's participation rate during the last survey was relative to other teams is a good way of helping them see where their strengths and opportunities are in promoting their team's participation. So this is a critical communication that I think is often overlooked, but is really important just prior to survey launch, because, as I said, most managers and leaders want to support this effort. And if we treat them as managers and leaders instead of just as employees, we can get that support as survey owners. So moving on to the types of communications or the efforts we make really on launch day and beyond. The idea here is if you've built a solid communication plan, you've thought through what the steps in this process will look like, launch day should be a breeze. You shouldn't sit there with your cursor over the launch button for 15 minutes while you debate whether everything was set up right or whether you made a poor decision. It should be really easy to launch when launch day comes. So it's nowhere near as dramatic as you might think it would be when you've planned ahead like this. Here are just a couple of items you want to make sure you hit on your launch day. So as I alluded to earlier, planting physical reminders like posters can be a rather unobtrusive way of reminding people that this survey is coming and that their feedback is wanted. Also, if you have TV screens in the office, you might leverage those. You want to distribute and post that launch day communication. So there are different people that you may want to post that launch day communication depending on the culture and the structure of your organization. Traditional thought might say the CEO or the head of HR might post the launch day communication to reach the most people. But if your organization is a bit flatter, a little less hierarchical, that may not be the case. So again, this is an opportunity for you as a survey owner to sit back and evaluate who are the people that our employee base expects or wants to hear about these communications from. Then launch, send those invitations. Depending on who or what you're working with, that launch may come from the vendor or the business partner, or it may be you clicking that button as well. And then lastly, just ensuring you've communicated the survey through all major communication channels. So be it Slack, instant message, email, on a company feed or a company bulletin board, whatever it might be, ensuring you've included these announcements in all major channels is key to promoting participation. You can see a brief announcement we posted on our company feed on the right there, just about a pulse survey. So another key part of the survey, the open survey window, is reminders, naturally. I think often when we launch surveys, we have this ideal state in mind where we get participation up to 100%. Yay, everyone has volunteered their thoughts and experiences. Instead, the goal should be to achieve good representation across the organization. Everyone has unique experiences, but also aggregate experiences or shared experiences. And what's more important than the ideal of 100% participation is just making sure that we're capturing all of those experiences, be it from everyone who's experiencing that or some or most. We just want to make sure that the perception that we're measuring here is, or rather accurately reflects that of the broader teams, departments, and the organization. And namely, we send 2 email reminders during what is traditionally a 1 or 2 week survey window. So those may be spaced out by a couple days or even a week, depending on how long that window is. We'll also, during that same window, send out 1 to 2 updates to senior leaders about participation in their departments. So we'll get current to-date participation rates from all of our major teams and send, say, a chart of those participation rates to those leaders, just a way of keeping leaders in the loop about where their teams are at in terms of participation. We've also found this is effective at boosting participation in teams that tend to under-participate. And then lastly, you may choose to send or post a final reminder post or communication to the feed or by email, just to remind people on that last day, hey, this is your last chance to speak up for 3 or 6 months. And once your survey is closed, say thanks. We, as owners, our leaders, we really, truly appreciate the feedback that our employees are providing us. It's critical insight into what the employee experience is like. And sometimes we forget something as simple as saying thank you for taking 15 to 20 minutes to letting us know how you're feeling, how you're doing, what you're hoping for from your work here with us. Second, it helps to start to generate some excitement about seeing results. You might include a tidbit or a quick, fast flash result that you think would be interesting to the organization. Or you might celebrate a quick win. Maybe you had or you achieved the highest eNPS score your organization has ever seen, or you hit your participation target. Anything really to show people that they contributed to this effort is commonly appreciated by the general employee base, and it also builds anticipation for the presentation of results that they'll see hopefully within just a couple of weeks. So the next thing to come is obviously communicating survey results. This is a huge effort. There are massive schools of thought and philosophy on action planning, and Monique will touch on that. But what's important here is that you're communicating results at 3 key tiers in the organization. The first of those tiers is at the company level. So some or all of the results, depending on internal choice, should be presented to employees at some sort of forum in which the entire company is paying attention. So that might be an all-company meeting, or it might be an all-company email. Whatever that might be, we need people to feel that the entire company is seeing these results at once. Next is the leader level. So leader level reports should be shared with senior leaders pretty early on. We aim at namely to share them within 1 week. Best practice is within 2 weeks, you're sharing leader level reports. And those reports should have benchmarking access. So leaders should be able to see how their teams compared to the broader company, as well as external benchmarks if possible. And there is also an expectation that leaders will trickle down results to managers. And this includes the provision of actual manager feedback to those managers. So say I'm a manager, my leader meets with me to discuss, number 1, the broader survey results of my team. And then second, any feedback that I've gotten as a manager. So here at Namely, we expect leaders to trickle down those results. Depending on your bandwidth in your organization, you might be able to reach managers more directly. And I think that this will depend on resources available and also the degree of ownership that you expect your leaders and managers to have over these results. I'm going to toss it back to Monique right now and ask her about how this cascading model sort of mirrors what she sees with clients.
Thanks for that, Eric. I mean, you name it, we see it. The cascaded approach is certainly what we see most companies doing. It can look really different depending on the kind of company, the size, the kind of org structures that they have. I will say that some organizations really do share results quite widely and broadly. whereas others will take a more limited approach. And not one of them is necessarily correct or better than the other. I do think it has a lot to do with the feedback maturity of the organization. And so I think it is important to build that trust and engagement in that process over time. I do think rushing into sharing results really broadly too quickly can have negative effects. So as I said earlier on, you really do want to prepare your organization for that feedback process. So one thing I guess I would say is that, regardless of how you're cascading, a couple of things are important. So firstly, that momentum after the survey results come in is super critical. So you want to make sure that you really keep that process of cascading streamlined. You don't want to spend 2 months cascading results so that ultimately managers have results in their hands, but the data is really quite out of date. Secondly, lots of communication strategies can end when the results get released. And it's really important to think about that loop of learning, understanding, and acting on feedback and helping people understand their role at each stage. And that's where I really love this diagram that we have here, which is our culture sprint diagram. So it doesn't just end when people have results in their hands. You'll want to ensure that your communication strategy creates clarity on what happens after people have results in their hands. So in our view, it's as simple as identifying an area of focus, ideating on that focus area, acting, and then coming back in and doing it all over again. And having that process of learn, act, repeat really drive the survey cadence that you set up for yourself in your organization over the year. It's really important to try and get this right early on, especially with your first survey. You want to really set your organization up for success as you evolve your feedback approach. So now we're going to shift gear into, I guess, understanding the effectiveness of your survey communications. And so there is actually a really simple way that you can do this, and it's embedded in your survey approach. So you can use these action-focused questions as a barometer for how effective your communications are. So as I said earlier, at CultureAmp, we use this philosophy of learn, act, and repeat to drive your survey cadence. And the really important part there is action. Employees really must perceive action taken from the feedback that they provide. If they don't believe that that's going to be the case, it's likely that they'll disengage from the process. The funny thing is that often the issue is not that organizations don't act, but they don't tell their employees that they act. So our CEO often refers to the concept as being communicating until you're blue in the face. So you really need to connect the feedback that people gave to the action that the organization took and take lots of opportunities to do that, not just when results are out and when you're in those active conversations around the results, but do it throughout the year. Continue to connect that feedback back. And you'll find that that's a really great primer for good participation in these kinds of surveys. Often what we see is that participation really drops off when people don't believe that this action is taken. So some of the questions you'll see on the screen here allow people to tell you whether or not they'll believe action is going to be taken, whether or not people have had conversations with them about the results, as well as whether or not they've seen positive changes taking place. And as I said, the communication strategy is really important to illustrating the action that was taken on the basis of their feedback. I think there are some really great ways that we can actually look at the effectiveness of communication more broadly. So I'm actually going to pass this across to Eric to talk about this slide.
Yeah, so in addition to measuring how effective we are at communicating our action efforts on the survey results, we should also be assessing and measuring perception of communication across the organization, independent of how we're communicating our survey results as well. If we want to be building cultures of open and honest communication in our organizations, we need to be assessing that as well. And so here, using this sort of tiered company leader manager model, you see 3 potential survey items you might consider administering and that we administer internally at Namely to make sure that we're effective at promoting a culture of open communication at every level of the organization. So at the company organization, you might ask, say, at my company, there's open and honest two-way communication. At the leader level, you're going to be asking employees whether they feel that they're being kept informed by the senior leaders at the organization, so the top level of every major department or team. And naturally, if we expect that leaders and managers are cascading information down to their directs, we want to be also measuring and evaluating whether our managers are doing so. So we also want to know, not just are the senior leaders keeping people informed, but is my manager keeping me informed? And we actually find out that this is a pretty strongly related to our scores on engagement and related items as well. Just feeling that your manager has your best interests in mind and that your manager is keeping you in the loop about decisions that affect you, that affect the company, and affect your peers. So I hope you've enjoyed the content that we had for you today. Here are just a couple key takeaways from what we've spoken about. It's clear from the beginning that communication is critical to the success of any employee survey, particularly engagement surveys. And so being really thoughtful and structured in the way that you approach your communication is critical to making sure that things go smoothly and that your employees are providing open and honest feedback. You also want to clarify the core themes of those communications and ensure that they are aligned throughout your entire survey lifecycle and your entire communication plan so that you're consistent in your messaging across every communication. I spoke personally about creatively branding your survey and how critical that can be to promoting participation and signaling to employees that this is an opportunity for them to speak up. And Monique spoke about how important it is to continue communicating through the action phase. So not stopping once the results have been announced or presented, but ensuring that our employees know that these results are being thought about, being planned for, and actioned around. And then lastly, we touched on measuring broader communication, not just communication about action planning for our survey. Really, assessing communication more broadly is the way that we, as a company and an employee base, can make sure that everyone feels included in what's going on. And if everyone feels included, they feel invested. And if they're feeling invested in their company, their work, we know we've built a happier and a healthier workplace together. So I'll pass it back to Alex now.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Monique. I think the content was fantastic. Based on the questions that we received, people were super engaged throughout. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to lob some of those questions up to both of the hosts today, and we'll touch on those. If you had follow-up questions, please feel free to add those in. We'll do our best to get to them in the allotted time. But if we don't, as you can see, please get in touch with us. At the beginning slide, you can email peoplegeekly@cultureamp.com or hello@namely.com with your follow-up questions, and we'll be sure to address those. And second, something that I should have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, for those of you who are still on, there is SHRM credit available for this course. And so if you'd like to claim that, please follow up with me at hello@namely.com and we'll get you the code. And before we move forward with the Q&A, we'll give the presenters a break to grab a sip of water. I just wanted to call out that Namely and Culture Amp, we do have an integration together, which a lot of super happy clients are using. And what it does is it makes it really easy to connect employee data from Namely to fuel super rich reports in Culture Amp. So as I mentioned, please contact us to learn more about how to get that set up in your accounts. And keep in mind, I know some people have to jump off here, but we are sending a recording after the completion of this webinar. Sometimes it takes a little time for the video file to process, but check your inbox for the slides and the recording of this webinar. I think from here, what we can do is move forward with the Q&A. So I think the best format might be, let's see here. I can ask some questions, some of the questions that I flagged to answer live, and maybe we can just alternate who answers them. Does that sound good to the presenters?
Sure.
Awesome. Great. So one of the questions early on that was asked by Catherine, and let's start with you, Monique. I think you might have some experience here. She says, we have a challenge with employee surveys. We have sent them out for many years and nothing is ever done with the data. Employees see no change. So now we have new management. How do we motivate employees to complete the survey at this juncture? So I'll let you field that one, Monique.
Yeah, thanks for that. So in just listening to that question, I think part of the answer is in the question itself. We heard from Catherine that nothing is ever done with the data. And so we spoke a little bit in the webinar around how important it is to A, act on the feedback, but then to B, tell people that you're acting on the feedback. And I think, some of the companies that we work with, if historically they've had challenges around that, then I do think it is important to have the CEO and the leadership team really, frankly, address the organization, recognize that maybe we've not acted in the way we wanted to in the past in terms of acting on this feedback, and just set the tone around moving forward and around how important this is, and make commitments to the organization around what they can expect. I think that's a great way to breathe new life into it and to reset those expectations around the action that would be taken.
Great. Yeah, so I'll also pull on Monique for this because I'm sure she works with clients who have all sorts of cadences for surveys. But internally, we made a decision a little over a year ago that we were growing at a pace at which we could not administer what traditionally might be an annual survey or even a survey, say, every 6 months. We knew that we needed to be pulsing the employee experience every 3 months because the rate at which we were growing and the rate at which the employee experience was evolving. And so our internal cadence is we do about 2 full surveys a year. Those are 30 to 40 items. And then 2 pulse surveys a year, which range from 2 to 5 items, depending on if we're just assessing sort of our key items or key indices, or if we're targeting specific issues that we'd like to pulse before our next full survey. So we alternate those full surveys and the pulses. So we get 4 surveys in a year. And we found for a company of our size, our growth, our stage, that works really well for us, and that leaders love having that feedback every few months to see if their change efforts are truly having an impact.
So I'll jump in and add to this. That's certainly what we typically see, particularly with companies that can move a little more quickly. Certainly streamlining the action process and making it nice and lightweight and having really frank conversations can help you move more quickly. We like to use that phrase of learn, act, repeat to drive survey cadence. So there really is no point trying to get 4 surveys in a year unless you can successfully act on that feedback. At Culture Amp, we do a similar approach to what Namely just described. We do 2 full engagement surveys and then follow-up pulse surveys. Just a quick word on pulse surveys. Pulsing means different things to different people. For us, it's really around kind of continuing to get that engagement measure, but then honing in on the key focus areas from our previous survey. We also pulse the entire organization. So that's a phrase that can help you keep in mind as you identify what the appropriate cadence for you is. But not every company is going to want to have a quarterly cadence. For some companies where, engaging your workforce looks really different to a tech company, having, twice a year or even once a year can be an appropriate solution. Think about different kinds of workforces, distributed workforces, retail workforces, warehouse workforces. All of that's going to look different. And so again, come back to that learn, act, repeat to drive the cadence, and then think about how you're going to drive action in the organization. And through those two things, you'll likely land on a cadence that works.
Great. Thank you both for that. And Monique, I think this question is probably geared towards you. I think you have a lot of experience to offer up for this one. And I think this is probably a challenge for a lot of folks. One attendee asks, would love to hear more about how to communicate poor results without narrating or reinforcing the negative.
This is a great question. This one, I often think about a story that that my CEO told me about a company who got negative results and then refused to share those results back to the organization. And he was speaking to one of their leaders, and they both had a laugh about it because your employees are already telling you what they already know. So, when you share those results back and you're saying, hey, we've got real challenges around learning and development, or people don't feel as recognized as they could, this is something that's already a lived and shared experience across the organization, or at least across parts of it. So I think we can all just take a moment to be human and recognize that, we're probably telling people what they already know. And that's where I think, just that authenticity from the leadership down, that genuineness, that commitment to acting, whether or not it's good or bad results, as well as leveraging storytelling approaches as well, can be quite helpful in bringing results to life and framing them as opportunities rather than things to get down on. I can tell you right now that even at Culture Amp, and we obviously live and breathe this stuff, there are lots of things in our company that we want to improve. There's lots of times that we look at results on the screen and we're disheartened or disappointed by it. And that's where I think it really comes back to having the leadership and the broader organization, turn that around into an opportunity and really excite us around moving forward through that challenge.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think we probably have time for one more question. But before I do that, I just wanted to touch on a correction that was brought to my attention. I think the correct email to reach out to the Culture Amp team is actually peoplegeeks@cultureamp.com. I'm going to send it through the chat as we get to this last question. So peoplegeeks@cultureamp.com. And second, I think the Culture Amp team is going to do a recap on their blog. So look out for that after the webinar, in addition to some of the other resources like the recording and the slides that we will share with you via email. So with that, I'd like to touch on one more question before we sign off here. I think this was a great one that was asked by Brianne Ness. Eric, I remember you talked about this. She asked, speaking of having a representative sample, what percentage of the employee population would you consider valid?
Yeah, so I think what's important to remember here is that there isn't necessarily a single threshold for a single organization. The key here is making sure that the respondents that you're getting and the feedback that you're getting is broadly representative of the makeup of the organization. So if 50% of your company is on the engineering team and only 10% of your feedback is on the engineering team or is coming from the engineering team, you may not have the most representative sample. You can address this during the survey window in some ways by, again, offering more targeted reminders. You might have a quick sit down with the engineering leader just to remind that leader to promote participation on their team. So there are numerous ways to address these gaps. But what's more important than sort of the number or the percentage of respondents is that the composition of your feedback mirrors that of the organization. That That changes slightly if you're conducting some more advanced sort of statistical analyses on the data. There are some standards there, but you can do some quick research online. If you're conducting those types of tests, you likely know how to arrive at those requirements. And if you're working with a partner firm that is doing them, they will know what those requirements are as well. So Monique, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, and actually, I think we've got a great Academy page on this, so I'm sure that Lexi can share that out as part of the blog follow-up. We see a lot of companies get quite hung up around statistical significance, representative samples, and I think that comes from a good place, which is that we want to have good data, but you don't want to let that derail the conversation. You don't want to get hung up around a statistical difference of 1% or the representative sample being 5% shorter than it would be, because again, you really want to focus on what people are telling you. The other consideration here is that, and this gets a little bit, I guess, scientific, is that with employee surveys, we're doing population research. So we don't really need to achieve statistical significance. We're not sampling in the way that we would sample a broader population like consumer research or broader, I guess, country population research. So I wouldn't worry so much on that. Focus on, understanding the data, identifying an area of focus and supporting the organization to act. And, make sure that you think about those statistical significance approaches with a grain of salt, and make sure you keep focused on that end goal, which is actually making the organization a better place to work.
Awesome. Thank you for elaborating. Well, thank you everyone for joining again. I think we went a little over the allotted time, but based on the engagement, I think we could even have a follow-up webinar. So thanks to both the presenters. I think we did a great job here. We will follow up with the recording, a blog post, as well as the slides. So if your question didn't get answered, reach out to us individually. And thanks again. Thank you, Monique and Eric.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, signing off. Thanks for joining, everyone.